In Toronto, men began disappearing, quietly, one by one. No bodies, no answers. Police believed they had simply left, but families knew something was wrong. Years passed, and the missing were forgotten, until investigators discovered something impossible. The victims had never left the city. They had been hidden in ordinary garden planters, compound apparel, and the man responsible kept returning, smiling, trusted, invisible. Tonight, we uncover how 8 men disappeared and remained hidden in plain sight.
Everything is connected. Nothing is random.
The weight of ordinary things. There is a particular weight to wooden planters in winter. Heavy, dense, the kind of weight that makes you wonder what's inside when you try to move them. In the summer of 2013, a grandmother in an affluent Toronto neighborhood stood in her backyard with a watering can. The planters her landscaper had installed were thriving, tomatoes climbing upward, herbs filling the air with something green and alive. Her grandchildren played nearby. The landscaper had been so thoughtful about placement. Across the city, in a different world entirely, a mother waited for a phone call that never came. Her son had left a bar on an October night in 2010. His car was found 3 days later. Empty, keys inside, no signs of struggle. Police told her that men like her son, immigrants, complicated lives, private struggles, sometimes just leave, start over, disappear by choice. She knew better. But knowing doesn't matter when no one is looking. By 2017, 8 men had vanished from Toronto's urban core. 8 absences, 8 families waiting, 8 cases that shared nothing except the fact that no one seemed particularly concerned about connecting them. The official stance was measured, cautious. Each disappearance had its own explanation, its own likelihood of voluntary departure. What no one understood yet was that the answers weren't hidden in the places people were looking. They weren't in flight manifests, or bank transfers, or abandoned apartments. The answers were in gardens, in soil, in the decorative touches that made wealthy properties feel complete. The answers were growing, watered daily, admired by neighbors, photographed for summer gatherings, and the man who knew where everything was kept showing up to work, smiling, reliable, trusted with keys to homes where children slept. These stories were never meant to intersect, but they did, in the worst way possible, in a way that would rewrite what people thought they understood about proximity, about safety, about how long the dead can hide in plain sight. Case A, the disappearances. Toronto's Church Wellesley Village sits at the heart of the city's LGBTQ+ community. Known locally as the Gay Village, it is a district of bars, cafes, rainbow crosswalks, and pride flags. During the day it feels open, celebratory. At night it becomes something more complex, a refuge for some, a hunting ground for others. Between 2010 and 2012, 3 men vanished from this area. Their disappearances were reported, investigated, and then quietly deprioritized. Skandaraj Navaratnam was last seen in September 2010. He was 57 years old, a Tamil immigrant who had fled the Sri Lankan Civil War. He worked odd jobs. He was private about his personal life, particularly his sexuality, which remained hidden from his family due to cultural and religious conservatism. On the night he disappeared, he had been at a bar in the village. Witnesses remembered him leaving. Alone, they thought, but memory is unreliable in dim lighting, in crowds, after drinks. His family filed a missing person report. Police interviewed acquaintances. No leads emerged. The case went cold within months. Abdulbasir Faizi disappeared in December 2010, just 3 months later. He was 44, Afghan-born, and had sought asylum in Canada. Like Navaratnam, he was gay but not openly so within his immigrant community. His car was found abandoned in an industrial area east of downtown. The doors were unlocked, nothing stolen, no signs of violence, just absence. The official theory, unspoken but implied, was that Faizi might have returned to Afghanistan, that he might have fled personal troubles, that men in his situation navigating cultural shame, Immigration stress and hidden identities, sometimes simply left. His friends insisted this was impossible. He had been building a life here, slowly, carefully. But insistence without evidence is just noise in an investigative file. Majid Kayhan vanished in October 2012, 58 years old, Iranian immigrant, refugee. He had survived a regime that criminalized his existence and found relative safety in Canada. He was last seen leaving Zippers, a nightclub in the village. Surveillance footage captured him on the street, walking, then turning a corner, and then nothing. By late 2012, Toronto police had formed a task force, Project Houston. The mandate was clear: investigate the disappearances of men from the LGBTQ+ community, determine if they were connected, and identify any potential predator. The task force operated for 18 months. They conducted interviews, reviewed security footage, monitored online activity. But in 2014, Project Houston was quietly shut down. No arrests, no significant leads, no public declaration of danger. The implicit message was damaging. These men were gone, but perhaps not taken. Perhaps they left. Perhaps their lives were complicated enough that disappearance made sense. The community felt abandoned. Activists argued that if these men had been white, wealthy, or heterosexual, the investigation would have continued. But investigations require resources, and resources require justification, and justification requires someone deciding that the missing matter enough. What no one knew yet was that Skandaraj Navaratnam's remains were already hidden, less than 10 kilometers from where he was last seen, in a neighborhood where people didn't lock their doors, where property values climbed every year, where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Case B, the exception. Andrew Kinsman was different, not because his life mattered more, but because when he disappeared, people noticed immediately, and they refused to accept easy explanations. Kinsman was 49 years old in June 2017. He lived in a modest apartment in Cabbagetown, a gentrifying neighborhood east of downtown Toronto. He was a fixture in the local LGBT community, a bartender, an activist, a volunteer with the AIDS Committee of Toronto. He was known, visible, dependable. On June 26, 2017, Kinsman left his apartment in the afternoon. He had plans to meet someone. Friends expected to hear from him that evening. They didn't. The next day, his cat, an elderly animal requiring daily medication, was found alone in the apartment, unfed, distressed. The door was locked from the outside. Kinsman's keys were gone. His phone was off. His calendar, visible on the wall, had appointments marked for the following week. Everything about the scene suggested interruption, not departure. Within days, Kinsman's friends blanketed the neighborhood with missing person posters. They organized search parties. They pressured police. They refused to let this disappearance fade into bureaucratic indifference. And crucially, they began asking a question that had been ignored years earlier. Could this be connected? While the Toronto Police Service initially treated Kinsman's case as isolated, standard procedure dictated investigating the victim's life first: relationships, finances, mental health. But Kinsman's community was educated, organized, and loud. They knew the history. They knew about Skandaraj, Abdul Basir, Majid. They knew about Project Houston's failure, and they knew that the pattern was undeniable, even if officially denied. In August 2017, 2 months after Kinsman's disappearance, a new task force was formed, Project Prism. This time, the mandate included reviewing the old cases, re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence that had been filed away. One detail emerged during canvass operations near Kinsman's apartment. A neighbor had seen a red van parked on the street the day Kinsman disappeared. The van had been there for several hours. Unusual but not alarming at the time. Security footage from a nearby business captured partial images. A red Dodge Caravan, older model, no clear license plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. Investigators began tracing red vans in Toronto, thousands of them. They cross-referenced registrations with individuals who had any connection to the gay village, to the missing men, to the neighborhoods where disappearances occurred. One name surfaced, quietly, without fanfare. A name that had been in police files before, but never in this context. Bruce MacArthur, 66 years old, self-employed landscaper, and a man with a history of violence that had somehow never been connected to a pattern of absence. Case C, the quiet normality. Layside is not the kind of neighborhood where people expect police investigations. It sits northeast of downtown Toronto, affluent and tree-lined, with property values that ensure a certain demographic consistency. The homes are large, well-maintained, with yards that require professional care. Between 2010 and 2017, several families in Layside employed the same landscaper. He was recommended by neighbors. Reliable, affordable, good with design. Bruce MacArthur had built a modest landscaping business over the years. He worked alone, driving a red Dodge Caravan filled with tools, soil, plants. His clients were mostly elderly couples or busy professionals who wanted their properties to look immaculate without doing the labor themselves. He was polite, soft-spoken. He had a grandfatherly demeanor that put people at ease. Many clients gave him keys to their homes so he could access backyards when they weren't there. Trust, in affluent neighborhoods, is often given easily to those who perform invisible labor well. One of MacArthur's signature design elements was large wooden planters. He built them himself, sturdy, rustic, decorative. They were heavy, constructed from thick wood, and could hold substantial amounts of soil. He positioned them strategically in gardens, often near fences or in corners where they wouldn't need to be moved. Clients loved them. They photographed them, posted them online, used them as backdrops for family gatherings. In the summer, the planters overflowed with flowers, tomatoes, herbs. In the winter, they sat dormant under snow, frozen solid, waiting for spring. No one thought to look inside. Why would they? They were decorative objects, part of the landscape, ordinary. One of MacArthur's longtime clients was a couple in their 70s. They had hired him in 2011 and were delighted with his work. He transformed their backyard into something magazine-worthy. The planters he installed became a focal point. Their grandchildren played near them during summer visits. The family dog napped in the shade they cast. During barbecues, guests complimented the craftsmanship. For years, this routine continued. MacArthur would arrive in his red van, work quietly for hours, water the plants, adjust the soil. Sometimes he brought new flowers to refresh the displays. The clients barely interacted with him. He preferred to work alone. They preferred not to hover. It was a professional relationship built on mutual disinterest in details. What the clients didn't know, what no one knew, was that MacArthur's relationship with those planters went far beyond horticulture. He wasn't just maintaining them, he was maintaining graves. The planters weren't decorative, they were functional, designed to hold weight, designed to contain, designed to decompose, and they did their job flawlessly for 7 years. The pattern. By September 2017, Project Prism investigators had focused their attention on Bruce MacArthur. The red van sighting near Andrew Kinsman's apartment matched his vehicle. Background checks revealed a troubling history that had somehow never been thoroughly examined in earlier investigations. In 2001, MacArthur had been arrested for assault with a weapon. The incident occurred in the gay village. He had attacked a man with a metal pipe during an altercation. He was charged, convicted, sentenced to community service and probation. The incident was categorized as an isolated act of violence, not indicative of serial behavior. His record was noted, then filed. What investigators now understood was that MacArthur had been frequenting the gay village for decades. He had profiles on dating apps targeting older gay men. He was known in certain social circles, though not widely. He was described by some as charming, by others as intense. Several men reported uncomfortable encounters with him, aggressive behavior, boundary violations, but nothing that resulted in formal complaints. He existed on the periphery, present but not prominent, dangerous but not obviously so. Surveillance began in October 2017. Investigators tracked MacArthur's movements. His daily routine was unremarkable. He worked his landscaping jobs, visited clients, returned to his apartment in the Thorncliffe Park neighborhood, but he also made frequent trips to the gay village. He used dating apps actively. He met men, and in November, he met someone new. Undercover officers observed MacArthur arranging a meeting through a dating app. The planned encounter raised immediate red flags. The language he used, the location he suggested, the time of day. Investigators made the decision to intervene before the meeting occurred. They feared waiting might mean another disappearance. On January 18, 2018, Bruce MacArthur was arrested in his apartment. At the time of arrest, another man was present, bound, alive, unharmed. MacArthur was charged with attempted murder, assault, and forcible confinement. But investigators knew this was just the beginning. A search warrant was executed on MacArthur's apartment. What they found was meticulous, organized, horrifying in its clarity. On his computer, investigators discovered folders. Each folder was labeled with a first name. Inside each folder, photographs. The photographs depicted men, deceased, posed in various positions. Some were dressed in fur coats. Some held cigars. Some wore hats. The staging was deliberate, theatrical, grotesque. The men were treated as objects, props in a performance only MacArthur witnessed. The link. The photographs on MacArthur's computer provided investigators with the most critical lead: the backgrounds. In several images, distinctive planters were visible. Wooden, large, handmade. The same style MacArthur built for his landscaping clients. Investigators compiled a list of all properties where MacArthur had worked. Dozens of locations across Toronto. They prioritized addresses where he had installed large planters and had long-term access. One address in Lakeside became the focus, the home of a retired couple who had employed MacArthur since 2011. On January 29, 2018, investigators arrived at the Lakeside property with excavation equipment. It was winter. The ground was frozen solid. The planters sat under snow as they had for months. They were too heavy to move easily, too frozen to excavate on site. The decision was made to transport the planters intact to a secure, climate-controlled facility where they could be thawed and carefully examined. Forensic teams understood what they were likely dealing with, but understanding and confronting are different experiences. As the soil thawed, the smell confirmed what investigators suspected: decomposition, human remains, multiple individuals. The planters had functioned exactly as MacArthur intended. They contained, concealed, and aided decomposition through microbial activity in nutrient-rich soil. Over the following weeks, forensic anthropologists and odontologists worked to identify the remains. 8 men, 8 lives reduced to fragments buried in decorative planters. DNA testing, dental records, personal effects. The identifications were confirmed. Skandaraj Navaratnam, missing since 2010. Abdulbasir Faizi, missing since 2010. Majid Kaihan, missing since 2012. Sorash Mahmoudi, missing since 2015. Dean Lisowick, missing since 2016. Selim Essen, missing since 2017. Andrew Kinsman, missing since 2017. Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, never reported missing. That final name, Kanagaratnam, represented a particularly devastating failure. He had disappeared in 2015. No one filed a missing person report. He was a refugee, isolated, vulnerable. His absence went unnoticed by systems designed to protect. He was invisible in life, invisible in death, until he was excavated from a garden in Lakeside. The failure won. The question that dominated public discourse after MacArthur's arrest was unavoidable. How did this continue for 7 years? How did 8 men disappear without anyone connecting the pattern? The answer was systemic. It involved bias, resource allocation, investigative assumptions, and the social invisibility of marginalized communities. When Project Houston was active between 2012 and 2014, investigators had actually interviewed Bruce MacArthur. He was known to frequent the gay village. He matched the general profile of someone who might have information, but he was cooperative during questioning. He had no recent criminal record that flagged him as high risk. His 2001 assault conviction was noted but not considered disqualifying. It was old, seemingly isolated, and he had completed his sentence. Investigators moved on. The decision to close Project Houston in 2014 was defended by officials as data-driven. There was no forensic evidence of foul play, no witnesses to abductions, no bodies. The most statistically likely explanation, according to investigative models, was voluntary disappearance. This was not an uncommon conclusion in cases involving LGBTQ+ individuals, particularly those from immigrant communities facing cultural stigma. But statistical likelihood is not the same as truth, and assumptions, however data-informed, can obscure reality when they align with existing biases. Activists and community leaders argue that the treatment of these cases was influenced by the victims' identities: men of color, immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ+ individuals who were not openly out, people whose lives were complicated by intersecting forms of marginalization. These factors made them easier to dismiss, easier to deprioritize, easier to forget. The contrast with Andrew Kinsman's case was stark. Kinsman was white. He was embedded in a vocal, organized community. His disappearance was immediately treated as suspicious. Resources were allocated quickly, and within months, the case that had eluded investigators for years was solved. Not because the evidence was clearer, but because the pressure to solve it was greater. In February 2018, Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders held a press conference. He acknowledged the failures. He apologized to the families. He admitted that biases, conscious or not, had influenced how cases were investigated. But apologies cannot resurrect the dead or return the years that families spent waiting. A formal review was commissioned to examine how Project Houston had been conducted and why it had been closed prematurely. The findings, released in 2018, were damning. Investigators had relied too heavily on assumptions about the victims' lifestyles. They had failed to adequately pursue forensic leads. They had not effectively coordinated with LGBTQ+ community organizations who could have provided critical context. And they had closed the investigation despite unresolved questions, influenced by resource constraints and case prioritization models that devalued certain lives. The review concluded that if Project Houston had remained active, and if MacArthur had been more thoroughly investigated in 2012, subsequent murders might have been prevented. Suresh Mahmoodi, Dean Lisowick, Salim Essen, and Andrew Kinsman might still be alive. Might. That word carries unbearable weight. The aftermath. On January 29, 2019, Bruce MacArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The plea spared families the trauma of a trial. It also meant that certain details, the precise methods, the timeline of each killing, the full extent of MacArthur's actions would never be publicly detailed in court testimony. The sentencing hearing provided some clarity. Prosecutors presented evidence that MacArthur had targeted vulnerable men, men who were socially isolated, men who would not be immediately missed, men whose disappearances could be explained away. He met them through dating apps, bars, social spaces in the gay village. He gained their trust. Then he killed them, typically through strangulation or suffocation. After death, MacArthur dismembered the bodies. He transported the remains in his landscaping van, the same vehicle he used for work, often with gardening tools and bags of soil concealing evidence. He buried the remains in planters at client properties, properties where he had unrestricted access, properties where families lived unaware. Forensic analysis confirmed that the planters had been specifically designed for this purpose. They were deeper than standard decorative planters. The soil composition included materials that accelerated decomposition, compost, organic matter, nutrients that fed microbial activity. MacArthur knew exactly what he was doing. His professional expertise in landscaping became the method for concealment. The psychological profile that emerged during sentencing described MacArthur as organized, methodical, and sexually motivated. The post-mortem photographs, dressing victims, posing them, indicated a need for control and objectification that extended beyond death. He treated human beings as possessions, as trophies, as decorations. Bruce MacArthur was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. At 67 years old, it was effectively a death sentence. He will die incarcerated. But for the families of his victims, that outcome provided no resolution. No explanation could make sense of what was taken. In the years following MacArthur's arrest, the property in Leaside where the planters had been located was sold. The new owners were unaware of the history at first. When they learned, they had the entire yard excavated and replaced, every planter removed, every inch of soil replaced, an attempt to erase the physical traces, but the psychological traces cannot be excavated. Memorials were held for each of the 8 men. Their families shared memories, photographs of them alive, smiling, whole. Skandarag, who had fled a war only to die in supposed safety. Abdul Basir, who sought asylum and found a grave. Majid, who had survived persecution and disappeared into a planter. Soresh, Dean, Salim, Andrew, Karushna. 8 names, 8 lives, 8 absences that should have been noticed sooner. What grows in silence? What was one? There is a particular type of horror that comes not from the act itself, but from proximity, from the realization that violence occurred in spaces considered safe, that death was hidden in plain sight, that ordinary objects contained the unspeakable. The families who employed Bruce MacArthur as their landscaper were innocent. They had no knowledge, no complicity, but they lived with the dead for years, watered them, admired them, let their children play near them. And that proximity is what makes this case linger. Not the brutality, which is unfortunately common in true crime, but the intimacy of the concealment, the fact that gardens, symbols of life, growth, renewal, were turned into graveyards, the fact that decorative planters, objects meant to beautify, held remains, the fact that wealth and privilege provided the perfect camouflage for atrocity. Bruce MacArthur understood something fundamental about invisibility. The people he killed were already invisible to many, marginalized, overlooked, easy to dismiss as transient, troubled, voluntary disappearances, and the places he hid them were invisible too, not because they were remote, but because they were domestic, familiar, above suspicion. In the aftermath, Toronto's LGBTQ+ community demanded systemic change, better training for investigators on bias and marginalized populations, improved protocols for missing person cases involving vulnerable individuals, greater accountability when cases are closed without resolution. Some changes were implemented, others remain aspirational, but what cannot be changed is the past. The 7 years when men were reported missing and then forgotten. The 7 years when families waited for answers that were buried in soil. The 7 years when a killer worked undisturbed, maintaining gardens, smiling at clients, returning to the same locations again and again. There is a question that haunts those who study this case. How many times did MacArthur stand in those backyards, watering the planters, while the families who employed him sat inside, unaware? How many times did he return to the graves? How many times did he see the plants thriving and feel satisfied that his system worked? The answer is unknowable. But the frequency doesn't matter as much as the fact. What matters is that for 7 years, the dead were present in the lives of the living, not as ghosts, but as fertilizer, as the foundation for something decorative, as the hidden weight in wooden planters that families moved, photographed and displayed. And the man who put them there kept showing up, reliable, trusted, invisible in the way that service workers often are, Seen but not truly observed, present but not questioned. He existed in the margins of other people's lives, and in those margins he built a graveyard. The planters are gone now, excavated, destroyed, replaced, but the question they represent remains. What else is hidden in plain sight? What other ordinary things contain the unthinkable? Who else is missing, dismissed, forgotten, while the answers sit quietly in gardens, waiting to be uncovered? The weight of wooden planters in winter. Heavy, dense, the kind of weight that makes you wonder what's inside. Now you know.